Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Melbourne Traditionalists podcast, episode 38. I'm Mark Moncrief from Upon Hope, and I'm here again by myself. David Hiscock won't be back in until this social isolation is over. The Wuhan panic continues. And until it's finished and everyone's able to go about their business, I'll be doing the podcast by myself. Although we're still in communication and there's no issue there, there's no problems. I don't want anyone to think that. And of course, David Hiscock has been putting the podcast up at XYZ, which I very much appreciate. Thank you, David. Now, as we've gone through this Wuhan panic, and it's exposed a lot of vulnerabilities, which people on our side have been talking about for decades, and now other people are starting to notice it. And one of them is our reliance or over-reliance upon China. And our government, and I guess all the governments in the West, tend to give the Chinese government, and therefore China, the benefit of the doubt. And I think maybe we should stop doing that. I think that's not in our interest. I don't think that's ever been in our interests. But what I thought I would talk about is our relationship with China. But to do that, I want to talk about Chinese history, and specifically China since 1949, so since the Communist Party took over in 1949. And what I'll do is I'll split it up into two episodes. So this week I will do 1949 to 1976, the end of the Cultural Revolution, and next week I will take up from 1976 up until the current day. Now, the most important thing to understand about China and the Chinese Communist Party is that there are two factions within the Chinese Communist Party, and they're known as the Reds and the Experts. And those terms are terms of abuse by their opponents. The Reds don't call themselves Reds, they're called that by the Experts, and the Experts don't call themselves that, they're called that by the Reds. So what do these terms mean? Well, the Reds are primarily people who join the Communist Party because they believe in communism. They're communists. They've read Marx, or they've gone to lectures, and they approve of Marxism, and they believe in the eventual triumph of Marxism, and of course in the revolution. And in China, the Reds tend to be Trotskyites. And Trotskyites believe in, as Trotsky did, in perpetual revolution. That Marx was a bit pessimistic, and Marx believed that eventually it was inevitable that there would be a worldwide revolution and we would arrive at a communist state. And Trotsky said, inevitable? That's a long time. Why can't we do this now? So what he proposed was perpetual revolution, constant criticism, constant self-criticism, and that would propel communism forward. And within the Chinese Communist Party, the Reds are very much Trotskyites. We would call them Maoists. Maoists are Trotskyites. On the other side are the Experts. And the Experts are so named because they know everything. And they joined the party because they looked at China, the China of the 1930s, the China of the 1940s, and they said, hey, this is bad. This is terrible what's happening to our country, to our people. We should change that. We should save our country. And they looked around And they went, well, who can do that? Who has a plan to actually save the country? And they decided that the communists had the plan. And it was true, they did have a plan. They had a plan for revolution. They had a plan for mass industrialization. They had a lot of plans and ideas. And the experts went, they're the people who are going to save China. They're the people who are going to save our country. So they joined because they want China to be strong. They want China to be a great power. They don't want China to be, for people to be able to invade it. They don't want people to be able to walk over it. Strength is very important to the experts. But the Reds, they looked at the experts and they said, you're not really communists. You're capitalist roaders. And what that means is that they're on the road to capitalism. There's no real difference between them. And the Reds said that the experts had to... The Reds said that, if you've got a bus driver, you've got a farmer, you've got a soldier, they have to study communism. They have to understand communism. They have to accept communism into their heart. Or else, what's the difference between them living in a communist country and living in a capitalist country? And the experts said, no, that's nonsense. The bus driver is the expert at driving buses, and the farmer is the expert at farming, and the soldier is the expert at being a soldier, and the Communist Party is the expert at being communists. So these people don't need to study communism. In fact, it's probably better if they don't. And those things get left to us. We make the decisions. Now, when the communists took over China in 1949 and proclaimed the People's Republic of China, the people who were in charge were experts. The experts were the ones who held most of the positions of power, but the leader of the Chinese Communist Party was, of course, Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was a Red. He was, as you would imagine, a Maoist. So they had to find a way to get him and his crazy ideas, because they absolutely did believe that they were crazy ideas. The experts had to find a way to get him busy on something so that they could actually run the country, they could actually bring peace, they could bring prosperity. And what they did was they basically said to Mao, you're in charge of foreign policy. Well, that's actually a traditional role for the head of state to be involved in, to actually look after relationships with other countries, to look after wars and defence and so forth. So that's what Mao did. Mao got involved in the Korean War. He was very involved with taking over Tibet. He was very interested in those foreign policy issues and problems. And the experts were really happy with that, because while he was distracted, they could actually go about making the country better. Now, in 1950-51, there was a massive campaign within China regarding land. And a few million people were killed during that campaign. And this is the thing, it's not a military campaign, it's a political campaign. And basically what they're doing is they're solidifying their control, the Communist Party's control over the countryside. So those who were landholders, landowners, those who were money lenders, all those people who could be accused of those things, they were often put on trial. Sometimes they were executed. Even the Communist Party came to see that this campaign was an excess. And the experts did a lot to get control of the situation, to try and stop things from being so chaotic. And after 1951, apart from the war in Korea, things within China calmed down enormously. And China had gone through an agonizing century of foreign invasion and bad rule. And now the experts were really focused on bringing that under control. And they did that until we get to 1956. In 1956, Mao launches what's called the 100 Flowers campaign, where he says to the intellectuals who he feels are not really on board with the Communist Party's ideas, that they should let 100 flowers bloom. That basically people should criticise the regime if they wanted to, because that would help the regime improve. But what he didn't actually expect was that people actually criticised the regime. Now, sure, he'd asked for that, but what he expected was people would say, "Oh, there's not really much to criticise. It's really going really well. We're really, really, really happy with it." And that's not what happened. Now, people didn't denounce the Communist Party. People didn't say, "Oh, we should get rid of it," or something like that. People knew that that was too much. But they did offer what they considered mild criticism. And the party just went berserk. The party just could not handle that at all. And they began to arrest people. But this was very much a movement of the intellectuals. But the intellectuals learnt, don't criticise the Communist Party, even when it asks to be criticised. But then Mao went, in 1958, 57, he then did the Great Leap Forward, which probably should be called the Great Leap Backwards. And his idea was that he would industrialise China. China was primarily a peasant society. People were farmers. Not that many people lived in the city as a percentage of the population. And he wanted to change that. He wanted to make China a major steel and industrial country. He went in 1957 to Moscow to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution. And while he was there, Khrushchev, the Premier of the Soviet Union, said that he wanted in 15 years to surpass the United States in industrial capacity. And China decided that they would surpass Britain within 15 years. Now, today, Britain is not an industrial country, but it was. And in 1957, it was a major industrial power. And now China is. But in 1957, they launched the Great Leap Forward. 1958, they launched the Great Leap Forward. And the Great Leap Forward basically said that we're going to industrialise, we're going to create much more food. We're basically just going to be a much stronger and efficient country. The experts went along with this, but really the Reds were in charge. The Reds had seized the initiative from the experts. And the Reds set about creating the Great Leap Forward. So they said that steel production had to be increased. So what they did was they encouraged people to build backyard smelters. And that worked about as well as you would imagine. So they would actually get people would have quotas, and they would have to produce X amount of steel. And of course it was terrible. It was just awful. They just didn't have the capacity to do that. But it still happened. And this is kind of the madness that the Reds had, that if it was a good idea, or they thought it was a good idea, then they'd go along with it, even when it was completely impractical. And one of those impractical ideas was what was called the 4 pest campaigns. So basically they would eliminate 4 pests: fleas, flies, rats, and sparrows. Now, the first 3, they actually make a lot of sense. They were trying to reduce disease, but the sparrows didn't. The campaign against the sparrows, and one of the names for it was Smash Sparrows Campaign. Yeah, that's pretty aggressive. But basically what they wanted to do was they said, well, sparrows eat the grain, and millions more people could be fed if the sparrows didn't eat the grain that people need. So what they decided to do was they would launch a campaign against the sparrows, and people were instructed to just frighten them, stop them from landing, just agitate them to death. So people would beat pots and pans, and school children were instructed to run after them and try and catch them. And birds died. The masses of birds died. And what that led to was locusts, because it turns out that sparrows don't only eat grain, they also eat insects. And those insects now started eating the food. Now, at the same time as the backyard furnaces, it was also an attempt to collectivise the peasants, to create people's communes. And this did happen. There were about 25,000 communes set up. And they were massive. And instead of farmers getting what they want, which is their own land, that's what the communists always promised the peasants, that they should support the revolution because their reward would be that they got their own land. And everywhere the peasants were betrayed, and instead they were herded onto communes where it's effectively a factory, except it produces food instead of carpets or whatever a particular factory does. And people hated it, but people detested it. And productivity within the communes always goes down because people don't want to be there. When they're working for themselves, when they're working for their own family, then people put in really hard work, most people. But when you're on a commune, well, what benefit is there? Most people said, well, there wasn't much. So agricultural production went down at exactly the same time as food is being eaten by locusts. So what happens when food is not being grown and being destroyed? Famine. So in 1959, probably 1958, the Great Chinese Famine starts. Now, the Chinese communists call it where are we? They have a number of names for it. They called it the 3 years of natural disasters. And then in the 1980s, they changed it and called it 3 years of difficulty. Well, that's a bit of an understatement. Basically, what happened is because there wasn't enough food, people began to starve. But the experts said, hey, this can't go on. So the experts seized control from the Reds, and then they proceeded to make everything much, much worse. Because what they were concerned with was national security. People can't find out what is going on. The outside world can't know that China is weak, that China is vulnerable. So how do you stop the entire world from finding out? Well, first of all, you have to stop your own people from finding out. So how do you stop your own people from finding out that there's a famine in your own country? You make sure that they get food. So the farmers who are growing the food have food taken from them. And when they resist, they're killed. So the famine actually gets bigger and bigger because the government is trying to make sure that nobody finds out. So you can go to a town and you can say, oh, in the countryside, people are starving. And people are like, well, what are you talking about? Here we have lots of food. That's just nonsense. But in reality, people were starving. The famine lasted until 1962. And somewhere between 20 and 40 million people died. This was a state secret. People didn't want to talk about it. The government didn't want to talk about it. The government didn't keep figures on this. They didn't record how many people died because they didn't want to know. So that means that we, and I would say forever, we'll never know how many people actually died. And the estimates are just all over the place. So I'm looking at some now on Wikipedia: 23 million, 22 million, 27 million, 32.5 million, 36 million, 45 million. I mean, they're all massive numbers. But in the end, we just don't know. And finally, they did bring things under control. But there's a quote here from a Communist Party official, and he said, "I went from one village and saw 100 corpses, then another village and another 100 corpses. No one paid attention to them. People said the dogs were eating the bodies. Not true, I said. The dogs had long ago been eaten by the people." And that's how bad things were. But then the experts were in control, but the Reds were furious with the experts. The experts had been in charge when the Great Famine had taken place, and they used that to subsequently gain control again of the Communist Party in 1966. And Mao announces the Cultural Revolution. And the Cultural Revolution is perpetual revolution, constant revolution. Force class warfare to happen. Encourage conflict, encourage aggravation, because that will break down the class barriers in society, and at the end you will end up with a classless society. What it led to was nearly a civil war, because in places the Red Guards, who had been formed by the Reds to propel the revolution, they actually took over army bases. They took over tanks. They took over weapons, as in rifles. They took over artillery. So you even have examples of tank battles and artillery battles between different factions of the Red Guard. And in the end, the People's Liberation Army, the army, had to come in and disarm these people. And sometimes they fought them, they killed them. But society began to break down because no one was actually in charge. The experts were actively being hunted down. They were being purged. They were sometimes being killed. The Reds were lunatics. They couldn't run anything. And so China was slowly getting worse and worse and worse. And the first 3 years, 66 to 69, were particularly bad. And then from 69 to 71, things continued, but a lot of people had just been worn out. And by 71, the army was actually running most of the administration within China. And the army began to rebuild the administration because it had been destroyed. And from 1971 to 1976, when the Cultural Revolution ended, effectively China was run by the army. And then in 1976, Mao died. And that's what brought an end to the Cultural Revolution. Now, some of you will have heard of a group called the Gang of Four. Now, the Gang of Four included Mao's last wife and 3 of his close associates. And basically they were used as the scapegoats for the Cultural Revolution. Even those who had risen to power on the backs of the Cultural Revolution, they wanted to get rid of it. They were sick of it. A decade of revolution was just way too much. So these guys got the blame and they were executed. And that was the official end of the Cultural Revolution. Now, after that, the experts took control again, and the experts have been in control of China ever since. The Cultural Revolution delegitimized the Reds, although I'm certain that they still exist within the Chinese Communist Party. but they are nowhere as powerful as they were before 1976. Now, one further thing that I'd like to talk about is the opening up of China, because in that time, China was behind the Iron Curtain, or as it was also known, the Bamboo Curtain. And I went to university in the mid-1990s and I studied Chinese politics. And the professor there said, if you read anything from the 1960s or 1970s about China, don't accept that at all. The truth is that we didn't know anything about China in those period. We couldn't go there. They didn't come here. It's all rubbish. It's all fantasy. It's all what people would like China to be. I haven't heard of any other subject area where people have said, hey, 2 decades of research, just ignore it. But we didn't know what was going on. And one thing we didn't know was what was happening between the Soviet Union and China. And in 1949, that relationship was very, very close. And the Soviet Union sent tens of thousands of people to China as advisors to help China become industrialized, to increase its food production and so forth. But by 1959, that relationship was very sour because the Soviets saw themselves as superior to the Chinese. And at first, the Chinese were like, well, yeah, you're the original communists. Yeah, all right. But by 1959, they'd had a bit of a gutful of being told how inferior they were. And by 1959, most of the Soviet advisors were actually expelled. The Chinese just told them to leave. That didn't happen overnight. It happened over a few years. But by 1959, the relationship between China and the Soviet Union was one of mutual contempt. But in the West, we didn't know that. And that relationship continued to get worse. And it got so bad that in 1969, there were actually border clashes between China and the Soviets, and hundreds of men were killed. And there was a fear that might actually become a much bigger thing. Now, in the United States, President Nixon wanted to find a way to outmaneuver the Soviet Union. And he had an idea that maybe China could be brought over to America's side, not necessarily pro-American, but just anti-Soviet. But he didn't know about a lot of the things that were going on. Nobody did, and not in the West. And actually, an American spy provided the information that finally led to the Americans making an attempt to form a closer relationship with China. And this is very important because all of our lives have been affected by Nixon going to China. And next week, I will talk a lot about that, about how our lives have been affected and about how the relationship that existed between China and the West, which was one of mutual hostility, completely changed. And our relationship with the Soviet Union would not be the relationship that we would have with China. Now, at the moment, that might seem a bit cryptic, but hopefully next week I'll be able to explain that a lot more. Now, anybody who likes my work can help me out by subscribing on Subscribestar. And to those who have, thank you. I will leave it here, and I will see you again next week with part 2 of the China problem. Thank you, and have a good day.